Come close now, weary traveler, and let the burdens of this long day finally slip from your shoulders, like a heavy cloak you no longer need to carry. Whether you have found your way to this sacred space for the first time, or you return as a cherished friend who knows the peace that awaits here, you are so deeply welcome in this quiet sanctuary we create together. This gentle harbor where souls find rest and hearts discover they are not alone in their longing for something deeper than the surface noise of everyday existence. If this evening marks your first journey with us into these peaceful waters of story and spirit, know that you join a community of seekers who have learned that bedtime can become something far more beautiful than simply an end to consciousness, but rather a doorway into communion with the love that holds all things together. The presence that never sleeps and never grows weary of watching over those who call upon its name with sincere hearts. And if you have walked these pathways of peace with us before, how your return blesses this sacred gathering, how your faithful presence enriches the invisible fellowship of souls who have discovered that ancient stories still possess power to heal modern wounds and bring rest to spirits that have forgotten what true tranquility feels like when it settles into the deepest chambers of human longing. Tonight we embark together on a journey that will carry us across continents and centuries, not through the rush of hurried travel, but through the gentle unfolding of contemplation that allows us to experience rather than merely observe, to encounter rather than simply learn about the most extraordinary person who ever drew breath upon this earth. We will walk dusty roads that knew his footsteps, sit on hillsides where his voice carried words that changed everything they touched, witness love made visible in human form and grace expressed through hands that blessed children and healed the broken with equal tenderness. But first, beloved friend, let us pause here in this threshold moment between the demands of your day and the gift of peaceful rest that awaits you. Settle more deeply into whatever surface supports you now, whether it be the familiar comfort of your own bed, where you have wrestled with countless concerns and found solace in uncounted nights of restoration, or perhaps a chair that has become your evening refuge, that special place where you retreat when your soul needs tending and your spirit requires nourishment that the world cannot provide, but that flows freely from sources older than civilization itself. Feel your body beginning to release the accumulated tension that has gathered in your muscles like travelers who have journeyed too far without rest. Those tight places in your shoulders and neck and jaw where worry likes to make its residence, thinking it is helping you prepare for tomorrow's challenges but actually stealing from you the peace that is your birthright as a beloved child of the one who created rest before creating work, who established rhythms of restoration before establishing patterns of productivity. Let each exhale carry away another layer of the stress that serves no useful purpose. Now that day has ended and evening has opened its arms to welcome you home to yourself. Notice how your breathing naturally begins to slow and deepen as you allow yourself to truly arrive in this moment. This precious pause between the relentless forward motion of time and the timeless peace that exists in the eternal now where divine love makes its dwelling. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to accomplish, no other person you need to become in order to deserve the rest and renewal that are being offered to you as freely as sunlight, as generously as rain, as constantly as the love that beats in your heart, without your conscious effort or control. The world outside these walls continues its spinning dance of urgency and anxiety, its endless cycle of breaking news and urgent demands and notifications that insist everything is desperately important and requires your immediate attention. But here in this sanctuary of spirit and story, time moves differently, flowing like honey rather than rushing like a river in flood, allowing space for wonder and room for the kind of deep breathing that reaches parts of your soul that have been holding their breath for longer than you realized, waiting for permission to exhale and receive. You are held tonight by arms that never tire of holding, surrounded by love that never questions your worthiness to receive it, supported by grace that sees not what you have done or failed to do, but who you are becoming through every struggle and every surrender. Every moment of doubt and every leap of faith, every tear shed in sorrow and every laugh shared in joy. This love has been seeking you all day through every trial and triumph, following you through every maze of worry and decision, waiting patiently for you to pause long enough to recognize the presence that never leaves and never forsakes, that knows your name and counts your steps and collects your tears in bottles precious beyond all earthly treasure. Chapter 2. Journey into Sacred Lands. As consciousness gently shifts and your spirit prepares for the sacred journey that awaits, feel yourself being transported across vast expanses of time and space, not through any effort of your own, but through the mysterious grace that allows human hearts to transcend the boundaries of here and now and enter into the eternal story that includes every seeking soul who has ever wondered if there might be more to existence than what meets the eye. More to love than what human hearts can contain, more to hope than what circumstances might suggest is reasonable or wise. The morning sun rises slowly over the ancient hills of Palestine, painting the landscape in shades of amber and rose that seem to hold within their beauty the very breath of the Creator, colors that no earthly artist has ever quite captured, despite millennia of attempts to translate divine artistry into human expression. You find yourself walking along a well-worn path, your feet finding easy rhythm on stones smoothed by countless pilgrims who have passed this way before you, merchants whose camels carried precious cargo between distant cities, shepherds whose flocks moved in patient procession toward water and pasture, families traveling to Jerusalem for festivals that connected them to their ancestors and their God through rituals older than memory, yet fresh as morning dew. This is a land where every hill whispers stories of divine encounter, where every valley echoes with prayers offered by generations of faithful hearts, where every stone seems to remember the touch of sandaled feet that carried the weight of human dreams and divine purpose. The air itself feels different here, charged with possibility, thick with the sense that heaven and earth meet in ways both mysterious and intimate, that the sacred and ordinary dance together in perfect harmony, each moment pregnant with potential for transformation and revelation. To your left, terraced hillsides cascade down toward the valley floor like green waterfalls frozen in time, their carefully constructed stone walls speaking of generations of patient labor, of families who understood that good things grow slowly and require both skill and devotion, both hope and hard work. Olive trees dot these ancient terraces, their silver-green leaves catching the morning light like thousands of tiny mirrors reflecting the glory of their Creator, their gnarled trunks bearing witness to decades of seasons, of harvest and rest, of abundance and scarcity faced with equal trust in divine providence that provides what is needed when it is needed in ways that often surprise, but never disappoint those who have learned to see with eyes of faith. The sound of flowing water draws your attention eastward, where a crystal-clear stream tumbles down the hillside in a series of small waterfalls, each pool reflecting the sky like a window into heaven, each ripple catching sunlight and scattering it in patterns of liquid gold that dance with a joy too pure for words to capture. This water has journeyed from mountain springs high above, gathering strength and purpose as it flows toward its destination in the great sea that receives all rivers with equal welcome, just as divine love receives all souls with equal grace regardless of the length or difficulty of their journey home. Children's voices rise and fall on the morning air like music composed by angels themselves, their laughter universal in its innocence, their play timeless in its joy, reminding you that some things never change across the centuries, that the human heart at its purest remains constant whether expressed in Aramaic or English, whether sheltered by tents or modern homes, whether surrounded by olive groves or city streets. These little ones run barefoot through streets paved with stones that have felt the touch of countless generations, their games requiring nothing more than imagination and the simple delight of being alive in a world full of wonders, too numerous to count. Women move with graceful efficiency from house to well and back again, ceramic water jars balanced on their heads with practiced ease, their conversations flowing like the streams that provide their daily needs, mixing news of births and weddings with concerns about weather and crops, weaving the fabric of community life with threads of shared joy and mutual support. Their voices carry the wisdom of mothers and grandmothers, the gentle authority of those who know that love expresses itself most fully through service, that strength reveals itself most clearly through tenderness, that leadership manifests itself most powerfully through sacrifice offered freely for the welfare of others. The fragrance of baking bread drifts from outdoor ovens where flames dance beneath clay surfaces, heated to perfection by hands that have learned the ancient art of transforming grain into sustenance, flour into life-giving nourishment that feeds more than bodies, that speaks of divine provision and human cooperation, of the miracle that happens when earth and rain and sun and human labor combine to create something greater than any of its individual parts. This bread will be broken around simple tables where families gather to share not just food but stories, not just nutrition but connection, not just meals but memories that will be treasured long after the last crumb has been consumed. Shepherds guide their flocks across distant hillsides, their staffs catching the light as they move with the unhurried pace of those who understand that rushing serves no useful purpose when caring for creatures that thrive on routine and gentle guidance. The sheep follow their shepherd's voice with complete trust, knowing that he will lead them to green pastures and still waters, that his presence means safety even when the path leads through valleys that cast deep shadows or across terrain that challenges tired legs and faithful hearts. There's something profoundly peaceful about this ancient scene, something that speaks to the deepest human need for guidance that is both strong and gentle, protection that never becomes possessive, love that leads without forcing and cares without controlling. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher in a sky so blue it seems painted by divine fingers, the land begins to reveal more of its sacred secrets. Here is where Abraham once walked in faith toward a promise he could not see but chose to trust. There is where David tended his father's sheep and learned the Psalms that would comfort countless generations of believers who found in his words the perfect expression of their own longings and struggles and discoveries about the nature of divine love. Everywhere you look, the landscape speaks of encounters between heaven and earth, between human need and divine provision, between finite hearts and infinite grace that bridges every gap and heals every wound and satisfies every hunger with bread that never runs out and water that never fails to refresh. This is the world into which the most extraordinary person in human history was born, not in palaces or centers of earthly power, but in the humblest of circumstances, among people who knew both struggle and joy, who understood that life's greatest treasures often come wrapped in packages that the proud and powerful overlook entirely. The stage was being set for a revolution unlike any the world had ever seen, not a conquest achieved through force of arms, but a transformation accomplished through the irresistible power of love that knows no limits, grace that extends to all without exception, hope that springs eternal in hearts that have learned to see beyond present, circumstances to future possibilities that exceed human imagination yet speak directly to human need. Chapter 3. The Man from Nazareth. In a small hillside village where morning mist clings to ancient stones, and evening breezes carry the scent of olive blossoms through narrow streets, there lived a young man whose very presence seemed to alter the atmosphere around him in ways both subtle and profound, whose ordinary appearance concealed mysteries that would soon transform not only individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human history itself. His name was Yeshua, though the world would come to know him by its Greek translation, Jesus, and while his hands bore the calluses of honest labor learned at his earthly father's workbench, while his face carried the warm bronze of Mediterranean sun, and his eyes reflected depths that seemed to contain both earth and heaven, there was something about him that made even casual observers pause in their daily routines and wonder what it was that set this carpenter's son apart from every other young man in Nazareth. He had grown up walking these same cobblestone paths, where children still played games their great-grandparents had enjoyed centuries before, learning his first lessons about human nature and divine love from parents whose extraordinary faithfulness had already marked them as different in a community where faith was common, but their particular quality of surrender to divine will created ripples that touched every life fortunate enough to encounter their humble household. Joseph, the village carpenter whose workshop echoed with sounds of creation and restoration, had taught his adopted son that broken things could always be mended with sufficient patience and skill, that raw materials possess potential that could only be realized through careful attention and persistent love applied day after day until what had been merely functional became beautiful, useful, and lasting. Mary, whose heart had been stretched wide enough to contain mysteries that would have crushed lesser souls, had demonstrated through every word and action what it meant to trust completely in purposes larger than human understanding, to say yes to plans that challenged conventional expectations about how divine power operates in human affairs, to carry with grace secrets too wonderful to share, yet too powerful to hide completely. Her quiet strength and unshakable peace had provided the stable foundation from which her extraordinary son would launch a ministry that would reach every corner of the earth and extend through every generation until time itself gives way to eternity, where love reigns without opposition and peace flows like a river that never runs dry. The workshop where Jesus had spent countless hours learning the ancient craft that connected him to generations of men who understood their work as partnership with the creative force that formed worlds from nothing, was filled with fragrances and textures that would forever remind him of lessons learned not through books or lectures, but through patient repetition of tasks that taught his hands to serve, his mind to solve problems, his heart to take satisfaction in work well done for its own sake rather than for recognition it might bring from those who measured worth by wealth or status or influence in the community's complex social structure. Here among wood shavings that curled like prayers rising toward heaven, among tools worn smooth by generations of craftsmen, among projects that would serve families for decades to come, Jesus absorbed understanding that would later flower into parables about building on foundations solid enough to withstand storms, about seeds that must die to produce fruit, about treasure hidden in fields that wise men sell everything to purchase, about pearls of great price that justify any sacrifice required to possess them completely and permanently and joyfully. But even as a boy whose questions during synagogue discussions revealed understanding that amazed learned men, accustomed to children who fidgeted during long readings and fell asleep during complex theological explanations, there had been something that set Jesus apart from his companions in ways that only became clear to those who looked back years later with the gift of hindsight, illuminated by events that would demonstrate conclusively who this carpenter's son really was beneath the humble exterior that concealed glories too bright for human eyes to behold directly without being transformed by the encounter. Village elders remembered conversations that carried weight beyond their simple words, discussions that revealed layers of meaning they had never suspected existed in familiar texts. They thought they understood completely after decades of study and debate and practical application to the challenges that arose when idealistic theories encountered complex realities that required wisdom accumulated through centuries of human experience, with both divine faithfulness and human failure, both answered prayers and mysterious silences, both seasons of abundance and times of testing that refined faith like gold in fire. His questions penetrated to hearts of matters that had puzzled rabbis for generations, cutting through centuries of commentary and debate to expose truths so simple that children could grasp them, yet so profound that scholars would spend lifetimes exploring. Depths they had glimpsed in moments of clarity granted by grace rather than earned through effort or achieved through academic achievement that impressed peers, but sometimes obscured rather than illuminated the essential truths that hungry hearts needed to hear and understand and apply to their daily struggles with temptation and doubt and circumstances that seemed designed to test the limits of human faith. When Jesus listened to ancient stories in the synagogue, where his ancestors had gathered for centuries to remember their identity as chosen people, his attention was so complete and his insight so penetrating that grown men found themselves seeing familiar narratives with fresh eyes, discovering connections they had never noticed, understanding implications that had remained hidden until illuminated by observations that seemed to come from someone who had been present when these events originally occurred, someone who knew the characters involved not as historical figures, but as friends and family members whose struggles and victories provided lessons for contemporary challenges that seemed new, but were actually variations on timeless themes. The religious authorities of his day, men who had dedicated their entire lives to memorizing intricate details of scriptural law and commentary that had grown like layers of sediment around original texts, would eventually struggle to categorize this carpenter who spoke with authority they could not match despite their impressive credentials and institutional positions that normally commanded automatic respect from ordinary people who assumed that education and ordination guaranteed spiritual insight and moral authority that could be trusted completely without question or careful examination of fruit produced in daily life and character demonstrated under pressure. These learned men inhabited a religious world that had become complicated beyond recognition, layered with rules and regulations that often seemed designed more to exclude than include, to burden rather than bless, to create hierarchies of worthiness that separated the supposedly righteous from the obviously sinful, rather than revealing divine love that embraces all humanity, without distinction based on performance or position or any human qualification that pride might claim as evidence of special favor or superior spiritual development that sets some souls above others in divine estimation. Jesus had grown up observing how ordinary people struggled under spiritual weights they were never meant to carry alone, watching how light faded from eyes that had once sparkled with hope when souls felt disconnected from the God they longed to know and serve but could not seem to please, no matter how hard they tried to follow rules that multiplied faster than human ability to remember them all, much less keep them perfectly without fail or excuse that might lead to condemnation from authorities who seemed more interested in catching violations than celebrating victories, more focused on pointing out failures than encouraging progress, more concerned with maintaining their own positions than ministering to the needs of people entrusted to their spiritual care. Yet there was something in Jesus that remained undimmed by the spiritual darkness he observed around him, a light that seemed to grow brighter rather than dimmer when confronted with human confusion and pain and systematic attempts to obscure divine truth beneath human tradition that served institutional interests more than divine purposes or human needs, crying out for compassionate response rather than additional religious requirements to fulfill or theological distinctions to master before being considered worthy of divine attention or acceptance into the community of faith. Chapter 4. The beginning of something sacred. The Jordan River wanes through the wilderness like a ribbon of life, connecting mountain springs to ancient seas, its waters carrying stories of prophets and kings, of crossings that marked new beginnings and cleansings that prepared hearts for encounters with the divine that would transform not only individual lives but entire nations whose destinies hung in the balance between faithfulness and rebellion, between trust and doubt, between surrender to divine will and insistence on human wisdom that so often proved inadequate when tested by circumstances beyond human control or understanding. For months, crowds had been gathering along these sacred banks to hear the powerful voice of John the Baptist, that wild and wonderful herald whose very appearance challenged conventional expectations about what prophetic ministry should look like, whose diet of locusts and wild honey spoke of complete dependence upon divine provision rather than human planning, whose garment of camel's hair announced his separation from the soft luxuries that so often accompany spiritual compromise and accommodation to worldly standards that value comfort over conviction and popularity over truth that sometimes demands sacrifice of everything the flesh holds dear. John's message cut through religious pretense like a sword through silk, calling people not to mere modification of behavior, but to complete transformation of heart and mind and purpose, to the kind of wholesale change that goes far deeper than external observance of religious customs that had lost their power to transform lives, because they had been divorced from the love that was supposed to flow through every commandment, like life-giving water through channels that had become clogged with pride and tradition and fear of change that might threaten carefully constructed identities built on performance rather than grace, on human achievement rather than divine gift. The multitudes that came to him represented every level of Palestinian society, from wealthy merchants whose success had not filled the emptiness in their souls to desperate beggars whose poverty had taught them truths about dependence that prosperity often obscures, from learned scribes whose knowledge had somehow failed to produce the wisdom they sought to simple farmers, whose closeness to soil and seasons had prepared their hearts to recognize authentic spiritual authority when they encountered it speaking truth that resonated in places they had forgotten they possessed, chambers of the heart where divine love had been waiting patiently for recognition and response. Tax collectors who had grown comfortable with their collaboration with Roman authorities, their betrayal of their own people in exchange for financial security that had cost them their souls and their standing in communities that once welcomed them as neighbors and friends, found themselves under conviction so powerful they could no longer pretend that prosperity purchased through compromise was worth the price they had paid in self-respect and spiritual integrity that once had been more precious to them than all the gold and silver that now felt like chains around their necks rather than symbols of success to be proudly displayed. Soldiers trained in violence and intimidation, men whose profession required them to think in terms of enemies and threats, whose survival depended on readiness to inflict pain and death upon others who might challenge their authority or threaten their interests or disturb the peace that served Roman purposes more than human flourishing or divine justice, asked what they must do to live lives pleasing to the God they had been taught to fear, but had never learned to love as a father loves children and provides for their needs without being asked or begged or bribed into generous response to genuine need. Religious leaders arrived to investigate this new teacher, some with genuinely seeking hearts that had grown weary of empty rituals and meaningless ceremonies that satisfied neither divine requirements nor human longings for authentic relationship with their Creator, who desired their hearts more than their sacrifices, their love more than their liturgies, their trust more than their traditions that had become ends in themselves rather than means to the end of knowing and being known by the God who created them for fellowship that brings joy to both divine and human hearts, when it flows freely and purely without pretense or manipulation. The baptism that John offered in the muddy waters of Jordan was far more than ritual washing designed to fulfill religious requirements or satisfy ceremonial obligations imposed by authorities who had forgotten the spiritual realities that physical symbols were meant to represent and protect and proclaim to watching worlds that needed to see divine love made visible in human obedience to divine commands given not to burden, but to bless. Not to complicate, but to clarify the path that leads from death to life, from darkness to light, from slavery to freedom that only truth can provide to hearts willing to receive it. Those who submitted to this baptism were acknowledging publicly their recognition that they needed cleansing from sins that stained souls more deeply than dirt stains clothing, that they hungered for righteousness they could not achieve through human effort alone, that they were ready to participate in divine purposes that transcended their individual understanding and personal ambitions and comfortable assumptions about how life should be lived according to standards they had inherited from cultures that knew prices of everything but values of nothing that truly mattered to hearts created for communion with infinite love that alone could satisfy their deepest longings and highest aspirations. Then came a morning that began like so many others, but would be remembered as long as human hearts beat with hope for redemption, as long as souls search for meaning beyond material success and temporary pleasure, as long as creation groans for liberation that only divine intervention can provide in forms that exceed human imagination, while satisfying human need with precision that reveals intimate knowledge of what every heart requires for complete fulfillment and lasting peace that the world cannot give and cannot take away once it has been received and treasured and shared with others who hunger for the same bread of life. Jesus appeared among the crowd gathered at the river's edge, not as spectator observing religious phenomenon from safe distance, but as participant, seeking to identify completely with humanity's need for purification and renewal that he himself did not require but would accept as part of his mission to fulfill all righteousness, to demonstrate perfect obedience to divine will, to show by example what it meant to submit to divine authority with joy rather than reluctance, with eagerness rather than duty, with love rather than mere compliance to requirements that might be observed without heart. Transformation that was the real goal of every divine command. When John saw him approaching through the multitude of people pressing toward the water, something in the Baptist spirit recognized immediately that this was the moment for which his entire ministry had been preparation, the arrival of the one whose coming he had been announcing with prophetic certainty, though he had never seen his face until this historic morning that would divide human history into before and after, into prophecy and fulfillment, into shadow and substance, into promise and reality, walking among them in flesh and blood that could be touched and embraced and crucified, but could never be defeated, because it carried within itself power of life over death, love over hatred, light over darkness that no earthly authority could extinguish or diminish or control. John's initial protest revealed his intuitive grasp of the cosmic reversal taking place before his eyes, his recognition that in the presence of this particular candidate for baptism, all normal categories and expectations were being turned upside down, that he was the one who needed what Jesus had to offer rather than the other way around, that the servant was suddenly face to face with his master, the forerunner confronting the one whose way he had been preparing through months of preaching that had drawn thousands to these muddy banks, but had all been leading to this single moment when prophecy would give way to fulfillment and preparation would surrender to presence that transformed everything it touched with healing love and transforming grace. But Jesus insisted gently that this baptism was necessary, not because he needed cleansing, but because he needed to demonstrate complete identification with human experience, including the longing for purification that drives souls to seek renewal they cannot achieve through their own efforts, the hunger for righteousness that can only be satisfied by divine intervention in hearts that have tried everything else and found it wanting. Everything except surrender to divine love that offers what human love cannot provide and gives what human effort cannot earn and accomplishes what human will cannot achieve through any amount of determination or discipline or dedication applied to spiritual goals that remain forever beyond human reach without divine assistance. As Jesus descended into Jordan's flowing waters that had witnessed so many symbolic deaths and rebirths, the very atmosphere around the river seemed to shimmer with anticipation, as if all creation recognized that something unprecedented was occurring, something that would mark the beginning of ministry destined to transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human history in ways that would become clear only as subsequent events unfolded according to divine plan that human minds could not grasp in its entirety, but human hearts could trust in its goodness because it flowed from love that never fails those who commit their lives to divine purposes that exceed human understanding but never exceed divine faithfulness to fulfill every promise made to seeking souls. When Jesus emerged from the water, droplets streaming from his hair and beard, his face radiant with something far more significant than physical refreshment, the heavens opened in ways that several witnesses would later describe as more profound than any natural phenomenon they had ever observed in lifetimes, spent watching weather patterns and seasonal changes that marked the passage of time in agricultural societies that lived according to rhythms established by divine wisdom rather than human. convenience or preference for predictability and control over circumstances that often serve divine purposes better when left in divine hands rather than manipulated by human planning that so often missed the mark entirely. The Spirit of the living God descended upon him in the form of a dove, that ancient symbol of peace and new beginnings whose gentle landing upon his head spoke of divine approval, so complete it needed no words to communicate what every heart present understood intuitively. That this was the Beloved in whom divine love found perfect expression, the Son in whom the Father delighted completely, the one through whom heaven and earth would be reconciled and humanity would find its way home to the heart of God, where love reigns eternal and peace flows like a river that never runs dry and joy springs up like fountains that never cease to refresh souls that have learned to drink from sources that never disappoint or fail to satisfy completely. Chapter 5. Words that changed everything on a hillside that slopes gently upward from the shores of Galilee's sapphire waters, where wildflowers carpet the grass in brilliant tapestries of scarlet and gold and purple that speak of divine artistry too magnificent for human duplication, where morning air carries the fresh sweetness of water and growing things that have never known the contamination of industrial progress or the pollution of human ambition run wild beyond all wisdom and restraint. Jesus found the perfect natural amphitheater for words that would echo through centuries and transform countless hearts long after the flowers had faded and new generations of blossoms had taken their place in endless cycles of beauty that teach patient souls about renewal and hope and the faithfulness of divine love that never fails to provide exactly what each season requires for flourishing rather than mere survival. The crowd that had gathered to hear this rabbi, whose teaching carried power unlike anything they had experienced in synagogues, where learned men quoted other learned men in chains of interpretation that often obscured rather than illuminated the truths their souls desperately needed to hear, represented every level of Palestinian society in a mixture that would have been remarkable in any other context, but seemed perfectly natural here, where human barriers dissolved in the presence of one who saw hearts rather than external appearances, who valued souls rather than social status, who welcomed all who came with genuine hunger for truth that could satisfy longings buried so deep in human nature that many had forgotten. Such longings existed beneath the accumulated layers of disappointment and disillusionment that life in a broken world inevitably deposits upon hearts that were created for paradise, but find themselves exiled in a realm where good and evil wage war for the allegiance of souls that yearn for peace. Wealthy merchants sat beside poor laborers whose calloused hands spoke of honest work that earned barely enough to feed their families. Learned scribes found themselves surrounded by illiterate farmers, whose closeness to soil and seasons had taught them wisdom that no amount of book learning could provide. Mothers holding babies shared space with elderly men, whose bent backs carried the weight of years spent in service to others who may not have appreciated their sacrifices, but whose needs had been met through love that asked for no recognition or reward beyond the satisfaction that comes from giving what others require for their well-being and happiness and continued existence in a world that too often values what people can produce more than who they actually are as beloved children of God. What united this diverse assembly was not social status or educational background or economic position, but hunger they all recognized in each other's faces, longing for something their souls knew they needed, but their minds struggled to name or define, or locate in a world that offered many forms of temporary satisfaction but seemed incapable of providing lasting peace that hearts created in divine image require for true flourishing rather than mere survival from one disappointing day to another. Hoping tomorrow might bring fulfillment that today had promised but failed to deliver despite their best efforts to find it in places where it was never intended to reside permanently. When Jesus began to speak, his words fell into expectant silence like seeds into soil that had been prepared by suffering and disappointment and years of religious instruction that had somehow failed to produce the righteousness it promised or the joy it proclaimed, or the peace it claimed was available to anyone. Willing to follow rules that seemed designed more to exclude than include, more to burden than bless, more to demonstrate human inadequacy than divine sufficiency for every need that drives souls to seek something beyond what earth can provide to hearts that know they were made for heaven, even when they cannot quite remember what that means or how to get there. Each phrase he spoke carried both immediate comfort for hearts weary of striving without achieving and long-term challenge that would require complete transformation of values and priorities and assumptions about what constitutes true success, genuine happiness, lasting security in a world where everything people typically trust eventually proves inadequate to bear the weight of ultimate hope that human hearts place upon finite things that were never designed to carry such enormous expectations, or satisfy such deep longings, or provide such complete fulfillment as souls demand from their chosen sources of meaning and purpose and identity and worth. He did not speak in technical language that religious professionals use to display their expertise or impress congregations with their learning, nor did he employ elaborate rhetoric that political leaders use to manipulate emotions and secure support for policies that serve their interests more than the common good of people whose lives would be affected by decisions made in corridors of power far removed from the daily struggles of ordinary families, trying to survive and thrive in circumstances often beyond their control or understanding, much less their ability to influence or change through individual effort alone. Instead, his words were so simple that children could understand their surface meaning, yet so profound that the wisest philosophers would spend lifetimes exploring depths they had glimpsed in moments of insight granted by grace, rather than achieved through academic study or intellectual effort that often produces knowledge without wisdom, information without understanding, facts without truth that transforms hearts and changes lives in ways that mere data never can, no matter how accurately it describes external circumstances or explains natural phenomena or predicts future events based on past patterns and present trends. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he began, and immediately the world's understanding of blessing was revolutionized in ways that challenged every assumption people had made about divine favor and human worthiness to receive it, about material prosperity as evidence of spiritual success and earthly achievement as proof of heavenly approval, that had led so many to conclude that their struggles and failures and limited resources meant they were somehow less loved or less valued or less important in divine estimation than those who seem to have been granted easier paths and greater advantages and more obvious signs of blessing. In a culture that equated material prosperity with spiritual favor and interpreted earthly success as evidence of divine approval, Jesus was declaring that those who recognized their spiritual poverty, their complete inadequacy to meet divine standards through their own efforts, their desperate need for grace they could not earn or deserve or claim as right, but could only receive as gift offered freely by love that gives without calculating cost or expecting return or requiring proof of worthiness before extending mercy to hearts that need it more than they need anything else, this world could offer to souls created for relationship with their Creator. "Blessed are those who mourn," he continued, his voice carrying comfort that penetrated hearts carrying grief so deep they had wondered if joy would ever return to lives that had been shattered by losses too painful to accept, too final to reverse, too devastating to understand in any framework that made sense of divine goodness in a world where such terrible things happened to people who had tried to live faithfully and love generously and trust completely in promises that seemed to have been forgotten by the one who made them, to souls that had believed those promises would protect them from the very sufferings they were now enduring. Their tears were not evidence of divine displeasure or spiritual failure, but precious offerings treasured by heaven, with intimate care that notices every drop and remembers every sorrow and promises, healing for broken hearts that human comfort cannot reach and human wisdom cannot explain, and human strength cannot restore to wholeness that only divine Love can provide to souls that have been wounded by life in a fallen world where pain is universal, but hope remains. Available to all who cry out to the God who hears every prayer and answers in ways that sometimes surprise, but never disappoint those who have learned to trust divine timing and divine methods that often differ from human expectations, but always serve divine purposes that work for good in lives submitted to divine will. Sorrow itself, in the mysterious economy of divine love, becomes pathway to comfort that can only come from the ultimate source of consolation. Joy that emerges not despite grief, but through grief that has been transformed by divine alchemy, from poison into medicine, from ending into beginning, from death into resurrection, life that proves stronger than every force that opposes. Human flourishing and divine purposes that will not be defeated by temporary appearances of failure or setback or loss. That breaks hearts but cannot break the love that holds universe together and calls every wandering child home to arms that never grow tired of embracing prodigals returning from far countries, where they spent their inheritance on pleasures that promised much but delivered little except emptiness and regret and longing for the home they never should have left. Blessed are the meek, Jesus declared with quiet authority that demonstrated the very quality he was describing, transforming gentleness from weakness into strength and humility, from failure into pathway, to true greatness that lasts, beyond earthly recognition or reward that fades like morning mist when tested by time and changing circumstances that reveal the difference between what appears impressive to human eyes and what actually endures when subjected to divine evaluation that sees not external appearances but internal realities, not temporary achievements but eternal values, not human applause but divine approval that matters more than all the praise this world could offer to souls seeking validation from sources that will never disappoint or withdraw their love based on performance or circumstances. In a society where power belonged to those willing to seize it through force or cunning, where success required aggressive self-promotion and ruthless elimination of competition, where survival seemed to demand hardness of heart and calculating selfishness that treated others as obstacles to overcome or resources to exploit, rather than fellow human beings created in divine image and worthy of respect and kindness and generous treatment that reflected divine character in human relationships. Jesus was revealing that ultimate victory belonged to those whose strength expressed itself through tenderness toward the vulnerable and service to those in need, whose greatness manifested itself not through domination but through liberation of others from the burdens that weighed them down and kept them from experiencing the fullness of life that divine love intended for every human being, regardless of their position or possessions or power, to command respect from those who measured worth by worldly standards that had nothing to do with true value as determined by the one who created all souls equal in dignity and potential for transformation. The earth itself, he promised with certainty that carried the weight of divine decree that cannot be overturned by human opposition or natural disaster, or any force that presumes to challenge purposes established before the foundation of the world was laid, and time began its march toward the fulfillment of every promise made by divine love to human hearts, would ultimately belong not to those who grasped for territory through violence or accumulated possessions, through greed or dominated others through manipulation that played upon their fears and weaknesses, but to those whose gentle spirits reflected the character of divine love that conquers through service rather than force, that leads through example rather than coercion, that transforms enemies into friends through persistent kindness that eventually melts the hardest hearts and opens the most tightly closed minds to possibilities they had never considered. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, he continued, acknowledging the deep longing that drove people to gather on this hillside despite obligations that called them elsewhere and responsibilities that demanded their attention and daily concerns that normally consumed their thoughts and energy that drove them to seek something their souls recognized as more important than food for their bodies or water for their physical thirst. something that could satisfy hungers that material prosperity could never touch and quench thirsts that earthly pleasures could never reach. Hungers and thirsts that were evidence not of spiritual failure but of spiritual health. Not of divine abandonment, but of divine calling to feast at tables where bread never runs out and drink from wells that never run dry. This hunger was not satisfied by external performance that might impress human observers, but left souls still starving for authenticity. Not quenched by religious activity that might earn approval from institutional authorities, but provided no real nourishment for hearts. Created for relationship with the living God rather than dead rituals that had lost their power to transform lives or connect souls with the love that gives meaning to existence and purpose to struggle and hope to hearts that had begun to wonder if their longings for something more than this world offered were foolish dreams or divine invitations to discover treasures that eye has not seen and ear has not heard and heart has not imagined, but God has prepared for those who love Him. Those who genuinely craved righteousness with intensity that matched physical hunger and thirst would be filled. He promised, not through their own efforts to achieve moral perfection that always fell short of divine standards, but through divine provision of righteousness that comes as gift to those whose hearts have been prepared by recognition of their need, and whose hands have been emptied of attempts to earn what can only be received through grace that flows from the source of all goodness. To anyone willing to acknowledge their spiritual poverty and accept divine wealth offered without price or condition or requirement for proof of worthiness that no human being could ever provide, because the standard is perfection and the judge is holy beyond human comprehension. Blessed are the merciful, Jesus taught with a voice that carried the authority of one who had shown mercy to countless hearts that had no claim upon His compassion except their desperate need for forgiveness. They could not provide for themselves, and grace they could not purchase through any payment they might offer in exchange for relief from guilt that haunted their days and shame that poisoned their nights and regret that robbed them of peace and joy and hope for better tomorrows than the yesterdays they could not change or forget, despite their best efforts to move beyond mistakes that seemed to define them more than divine love that was greater than their failures. Those who showed mercy to others who had wronged them or disappointed them or failed to meet their expectations would themselves receive mercy from the divine heart that specializes in forgiveness and delights in restoration, and never grows weary of offering fresh starts to those who have exhausted human patience, but have not yet exhausted divine love that knows no limits and keeps no record of wrongs and covers multitudes of sins with grace that transforms guilt into gratitude and shame into wonder and regret into testimony of redemption that encourages other broken hearts to believe that they too might find healing and hope and home in arms that never reject anyone who comes in sincere repentance and genuine faith. This mercy was not weakness that enabled destructive behavior or sentimentality that ignored justice and accountability, but strength that chose to absorb pain rather than inflict it, wisdom that understood broken people need healing more than condemnation, love that recognized potential for transformation in hearts that seemed beyond hope of redemption according to human judgment that sees present condition rather than future possibility that divine grace can accomplish in cooperation with human willingness to be changed from glory to glory through power that works within those who trust completely in promises that seem too good to be true, but are actually too good not to be true when they come from lips that never lie and heart that never fails to keep its word. Blessed are the pure in heart, He declared, speaking to the longing for inner clarity that had been clouded by compromise and confusion and competing loyalties that pulled souls in different directions until they no longer knew what they truly valued or desired or believed about ultimate questions that determine how life should be lived and what purposes are worth pursuing regardless of cost or consequences or opposition from those who profit from maintaining systems that serve the few at expense of the many, systems that pure hearts instinctively recognize as contrary to divine justice and mercy and love. that extends to all without partiality or prejudice or preference, based on human categories that divide what divine love unites. Those whose hearts had been cleansed by divine forgiveness and unified by divine love would see God, not just in some future heavenly realm, but in present, earthly circumstances where divine presence could be recognized by eyes that had been opened. Perceive spiritual realities normally hidden from vision that focuses only on material surfaces and misses the deeper currents of divine activity that flow through every moment and every situation and every relationship where love meets need and grace encounters. Brokenness and hope plant seeds in ground that seems too hard or too rocky or too shallow to produce fruit, but surprises everyone when divine life proves stronger than human assessment of impossibility. This purity was not achieved through human effort to eliminate every imperfect thought or emotion that arose in minds still affected by sinful nature that wars against spiritual aspirations, but received through divine grace that covers sins with righteousness of Christ and transforms hearts through love that makes holiness attractive rather than burdensome, possible rather than impossible, joy rather than duty that weighs down spirits and crushes hope of ever-pleasing God, whose standards seem designed to discourage rather than inspire those who long to live according to divine will but found themselves constantly falling short of perfection that seemed required, but remained unattainable through any amount of human effort or determination or religious activity. Chapter 6. Miracles of Compassion as Word of Jesus is extraordinary. Teaching spread like ripples across the still surface of Galilee's social landscape, reaching into villages and towns where stories of hope and healing traveled faster than any Roman messenger could carry official dispatches, where conversations around wells and in marketplaces began to center on this carpenter-turned-teacher, whose words carried weight that pressed against hearts and opened them to possibilities they had never dared imagine. Something else began happening that amazed everyone who witnessed it firsthand or heard reliable accounts from neighbors whose integrity vouched for the truth of testimonies that challenged every natural law yet were corroborated by too many credible witnesses to dismiss as wishful thinking or mass hysteria or elaborate deception designed to promote a false prophet seeking followers and fame. The same divine power that flowed through his teachings like living water through channels that had been dry for generations began manifesting itself in healings and restorations that defied medical explanation while demonstrating the heart of divine love toward every form of suffering that mars the beauty of creation and breaks the hearts of creatures made in the image of perfect wholeness that sin has corrupted, but grace can restore to original design that reflects divine glory and serves divine purposes that extend far beyond individual benefit to encompass cosmic restoration of all things to their intended state of harmony between Creator and creation, between heaven and earth, between divine will and human response that flows from hearts grateful for mercy received and eager to share blessing freely given. These were not theatrical displays designed to impress crowds or validate theological credentials or establish institutional authority over populations seeking spiritual leadership that could be trusted to guide them safely through treacherous waters of moral confusion and religious competition that characterized their generation, just as it characterizes every generation that has forgotten its way home to the heart of God, where love reigns supreme and truth illuminates every dark corner, where deception likes to hide and power serves rather than exploits those who look to leaders for direction and protection and wisdom that comes from above rather than human cleverness that so often leads astray. Instead, these miracles were spontaneous responses to human need that revealed what divine compassion looks like when it encounters pain and brokenness with power sufficient to restore what was lost and heal what was wounded and resurrect what had died under the weight of living in a world where good intentions often produce disappointing results and earnest efforts frequently fall short of hoped for outcomes, and sincere prayers sometimes seem to go unanswered despite faith that believes. God hears and cares, and will respond in ways that serve ultimate good, even when immediate relief does not come as quickly or completely as desperate hearts desire. In the busy fishing village of Capernaum, where morning air carried mingled scents of nets drying in, Mediterranean sun and bread baking in ovens tended by women whose hands had learned to transform simple grain into nourishment that sustained families through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, seasons of celebration and seasons of mourning, seasons of hope and seasons of testing that proved the strength of faith and the depth of love that bound communities together in mutual support and shared responsibility for the welfare of all. A Roman centurion's beloved servant lay dying on a bed that had become his prison, consumed by fever that burned away his strength and paralysis that stole his mobility, leaving him completely dependent on others for every need while his condition resisted every treatment the most skilled physicians could provide with all their accumulated knowledge and expensive remedies. This military officer, though representing occupying forces that many Jews regarded as enemies of everything they held sacred about their faith and culture and national identity that had been preserved through centuries of foreign domination and attempts at forced assimilation, had somehow transcended ethnic and political barriers that typically separated conqueror from conquered by demonstrating fairness in his dealings and genuine care for people under his authority that went far beyond mere professional duty or calculated self-interest designed to maintain peace and order that served Roman purposes more than human welfare or divine justice that calls all people to treat others with dignity and respect regardless of their position or power or ability to reciprocate kindness shown. His love for Jewish customs and respect for Jewish faith had moved him to fund construction of their local synagogue with his own resources, not as a political gesture designed to win favor or maintain stability among populations that might otherwise prove troublesome, but as authentic expression of appreciation for spiritual truths that had touched his heart despite his foreign birth and military training that emphasized loyalty to Rome above all other considerations, including personal conviction or moral qualms that might interfere with obedience to orders that sometimes conflicted with conscience, formed by exposure to divine truth that transcends national boundaries and cultural differences. When news reached him that Jesus was approaching Capernaum, something in the centurion's spirit recognized that this teacher from Nazareth possessed authority of a completely different kind than any earthly power he had known in years of military service under various commanders who wielded authority through force and maintained discipline through fear of punishment that might range from loss of pay to loss of life, depending on the severity of offense and the mood of superior officers, whose decisions could not be questioned or appealed once they had been rendered with finality, that left no room for mercy or reconsideration based on changed circumstances or new information. His faith was so profound and his understanding of spiritual authority so clear that he sent word to Jesus through Jewish elders who could vouch for his character and petition on behalf of someone whose ethnic background might prejudice less generous hearts against his request, explaining that there was no need for the teacher to actually visit his house where ceremonial defilement might result from contact with Gentile dwelling according to religious laws that he respected even though they did not apply to him, that Jesus need only speak a word from whatever distance seemed appropriate, and healing would occur as surely as soldiers obeyed commands from legitimate authority that expected compliance without question or delay or partial obedience. The faith demonstrated by this Gentile soldier amazed even Jesus, who declared to Jewish crowds following him that he had not found such trust anywhere in Israel among people who had been raised from childhood with stories of divine power and miraculous interventions that should have prepared them to recognize supernatural authority when it appeared among them in human form, but somehow had been obscured by familiarity that breeds contempt or expectation that makes extraordinary seem ordinary, until something breaks through accumulated assumptions to reveal wonder that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for eyes to see and hearts to believe. what minds could not fully comprehend, but souls could receive as gift. At the very moment Jesus spoke words of healing from miles away, without any physical contact or medical intervention or gradual process of recovery. That might be explained through natural means or attributed to coincidental improvement that sometimes occurs when bodies rally their own resources against disease. The centurion's servant opened eyes that had been closed in semi-conscious delirium, sat up in bed that had seemed destined to become his deathbed, asked for food with appetite that had been absent for weeks, and discovered that both fever and paralysis had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind no weakness or residual effects, but only perfect health that testified to power greater than disease and love greater than human ability to comprehend or explain or contain, within categories that finite minds use to organize infinite realities. Chapter 7. Walking among the people. What distinguished Jesus' ministry from every other religious movement of his time? What set him apart from countless other teachers and prophets and reformers who appeared throughout Palestine claiming divine authority for their particular interpretations of ancient texts or their specific programs for spiritual renewal that would restore Israel to former glory and divine favor that had been forfeited through generations of unfaithfulness and compromise with foreign powers and pagan influences was not merely the power of his teachings or the wonder of his miracles, though both were extraordinary beyond anything his contemporaries had ever witnessed or imagined, possible within boundaries of human experience shaped by generations of disappointment and unmet expectations about messianic deliverance that had been promised but never seemed to arrive. The truly revolutionary aspect of his approach was the way he moved through the world like someone who belonged everywhere and was welcome nowhere, according to conventional standards that measured worthiness by social status and religious credentials and ethnic purity and moral performance that created hierarchies of acceptability in communities that had forgotten their original calling to be liked to nations through demonstration of divine love rather than human prejudice disguised as spiritual discernment that served to exclude rather than include, to separate rather than unite, to judge rather than heal hearts that desperately needed to know they were valued and wanted and loved, regardless of their past mistakes or present circumstances. The social barriers he consistently crossed with such natural grace that observers were left breathless by the casual way he dismantled centuries of carefully constructed divisions, simply by treating every person as if they possessed infinite worth. In the eyes of divine love, challenged every assumption about divine favor and human worthiness that had been built up through generations of religious teaching designed more to maintain control than minister to need, more to preserve institutional power than proclaim good news that God's love knows no boundaries and recognizes no categories that would exclude anyone from receiving grace, freely offered to all who have breath in their lungs and blood in their veins and souls created in divine image. In bustling marketplaces where merchants hawked their wares under colorful awnings that provided relief from Mediterranean sun, where air filled with sounds of bargaining conducted in multiple languages by people whose diverse backgrounds reflected Galilee's position as crossroads between different cultures and civilizations that had learned to coexist through necessity, if not always through genuine understanding or mutual respect. Jesus walked with the relaxed familiarity of someone completely comfortable among ordinary people, living ordinary lives filled with extraordinary dignity that came from being image bearers of divine love, whether they recognized that identity or had forgotten it, through years of being treated as less than human by those who considered themselves more favored by God or more deserving of respect and honor. Unlike religious leaders who maintained careful distance from anyone whose contact might compromise their ritual purity or threaten their social standing with authorities who valued conformity more than compassion and order more than justice that sometimes requires disruption of systems that serve privileged few at expense of vulnerable many, Jesus seemed to genuinely enjoy the company of tax collectors whose collaboration with Roman occupation forces had made them wealthy but miserable. Of fishermen whose honest labor connected them to rhythms older than human memory. Of former prostitutes whose past provided no barrier to present transformation. When they encountered love that saw not what they had been, but what they could become through grace that makes all things new. He would pause at potters' workshops where skilled hands shaped clay into vessels useful and beautiful, examining their work with genuine interest while asking questions that revealed not condescension, but authentic curiosity about crafts that had been passed down through generations of families whose understanding of their work transcended mere economics to embrace something closer to worship, to partnership with creative forces that turn earth into art. Raw materials into objects that serve human need while reflecting divine beauty that speaks to souls hungry for evidence that this world contains more than random. Collision of atoms governed by impersonal laws that care nothing for human hopes or dreams or longings for meaning. At bakers' stalls were warm fragrances of fresh bread, mixed with conversations about weather and politics and community news that connected neighbors to shared life that extended beyond individual concerns to encompass collective hopes and fears and dreams. Jesus would breathe deeply of scents that reminded him of his mother's kitchen, where love was expressed through meals, prepared with care that nourished more than bodies, that fed souls hungry for evidence that someone cared enough about their well-being to invest time and effort in providing sustenance that spoke of home and belonging and acceptance that asked no questions about worthiness but simply gave because giving was its nature and joy was its reward. His words transformed everyday experiences into windows through which listeners could glimpse eternal realities normally hidden behind veils of familiarity that make miraculous seem mundane, and sacred appear ordinary until someone with eyes to see and voice to explain reveals depths of meaning that had been present all along but required divine revelation to become visible to hearts that had grown accustomed to surface appearances rather than underlying truths that give significance to moments that might otherwise seem trivial or forgettable, but actually pulse with purpose that connects finite experience to infinite love that notices everything and forgets nothing and treasures every sincere response to divine invitation. Children seemed especially drawn to Jesus with instinctive recognition that bypassed intellectual analysis and went straight to heart's understanding of who could be trusted with fears and dreams and questions that adults often dismissed as unimportant or naive, but which actually represented purest expressions of human need for love that accepts without condition, guidance that leads without manipulation, protection that never fails even when circumstances suggest otherwise to minds that measure divine faithfulness by immediate visible results, rather than long-term spiritual development that often requires patience and trust in processes that unfold according to divine timing rather than human urgency. They sensed in him the kind of adult who would listen to their concerns without condescension, who would enter into their games without embarrassment, who would take seriously their observations about life that often revealed truths sophisticated minds had overlooked in their rush to appear wise and learned and worthy of respect from peers who measured intelligence by complexity rather than clarity, by obscurity rather than accessibility, by ability to complicate simple truths rather than illuminate profound mysteries in ways that even children could understand and embrace and live by with joy. When his disciples attempted to discourage such interruptions, thinking their master's time was too valuable to be spent on those who could contribute nothing to his mission, except interruption and distraction from more important work of teaching adults who had influence and resources that might advance kingdom purposes through channels that children could never provide. Jesus' response revealed the heart of his entire approach to ministry and relationship and values that would characterize communities formed in his name, when they remembered his example rather than substituting human wisdom for divine priorities that often confound human expectations. "Let little children come to me," he said with authority that stopped his disciples' protective intervention, while revealing truth They had not yet grasped about the nature of the kingdom he had come to establish. And do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. In their unguarded trust that had not yet learned to doubt promises made by those who claimed to love them, in their capacity for wonder that found miracles in ordinary moments and saw beauty in simple things, in their willingness to believe good things about people they had just met rather than approaching every new relationship with suspicion and calculation that characterized adult interactions shaped by disappointment and betrayal. Jesus found perfect illustrations of faith that opens hearts to receive divine love without reservation or condition or demand for proof. Chapter 8. Fellow seekers of peace, as we pause together here in this sacred flow of story and spirit. As your breathing has naturally deepened and your body has settled into the blessed rhythm of true rest, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something beautiful that is happening in this very instant across our sleeping world. You are not alone in this peaceful sanctuary we have created together through shared seeking and mutual hunger for the kind of truth that nourishes souls rather than merely informing minds, for the quality of love that transforms hearts rather than simply educating intellects about theological concepts that remain cold and distant, until they are warmed by personal encounter with the living presence that makes all doctrines come alive with power to heal and hope to sustain and joy to overflow. Somewhere in the quiet darkness of this night, other weary travelers like yourself have found their way to the same refuge. Other souls carrying burdens that seem too heavy for human shoulders to bear alone. Other hearts longing for peace that passes understanding and love that never fails and hope that anchors the soul in storms that threaten to overwhelm finite courage with infinite challenges that require divine strength to endure and overcome and transform into testimonies of grace that encourage others who walk similar paths through valleys that seem endless until suddenly the dawn breaks and light floods landscapes that had been hidden in shadow. We have become, whether we fully realize it or not, a community of fellow seekers united not by geography or denomination or agreement on every detail of theology and practice, but by our shared recognition that our souls were created for more than this world typically offers. That our hearts contain chambers that can only be filled by connection with love that knows no limits and places, no conditions on acceptance, and never grows weary of extending mercy to those who have exhausted their own resources and discovered that human strength is insufficient for challenges that life presents to finite beings, living in a broken world where pain is universal, but hope remains available to all who cry out to heaven for help. If you have been walking these peaceful pathways with us for some time, your presence has blessed every journey we have taken together. Your faithful return to this sanctuary of rest and reflection has helped create the atmosphere of trust and safety that allows hearts to open and receive what they most desperately need. Your participation in the invisible fellowship of souls who gather around these ancient stories has added strength to the circle of love that extends from this moment into eternity, where all seeking finds fulfillment and all longing discovers satisfaction beyond human imagination or description. And if this marks your first time joining our community of evening pilgrims, what perfect timing has brought you to this particular story on this particular night when your heart was ready to receive the good news that has been transforming lives for 2,000 years and will continue doing so until time gives way to eternity and faith becomes sight and hope becomes reality and love reigns without opposition or limitation or end. Your arrival in this sacred space is not accident but providence, not coincidence but divine appointment, not random but purposeful invitation from the One who knows your name and counts your steps and sees your tears and wants nothing more than to gather you close and whisper peace into every anxiety and speak healing into every wound and breathe life into every dream that circumstances have tried to convince you is impossible. The story we are sharing tonight about Jesus walking among ordinary people with extraordinary love is itself an invitation to experience that same love in personal and intimate ways that transform not only Individual hearts, but entire communities that learn to see each other through eyes of compassion rather than judgment, to treat each other with kindness rather than criticism, to extend grace rather than condemnation to fellow strugglers, who are doing their best with whatever strength and wisdom and resources they possess in circumstances that often seem designed to test the limits of human endurance and faith. If these ancient accounts of divine love made visible in human form have stirred something beautiful in your spirit tonight, if you find yourself drawn to explore more deeply the countless ways that following Jesus can illuminate every aspect of contemporary life with meaning and purpose, and hope that no earthly circumstance can diminish or destroy, then perhaps you would consider making this peaceful community a regular part of your spiritual journey by subscribing to join us for future explorations of truth that heals and love that never fails, and stories that remind us who we really are and whose we really are. Beneath all the roles we play and masks we wear to protect ourselves from a world that often seems too harsh for hearts as tender as those that God creates and cherishes and calls His own. By becoming part of our growing family of subscribers, you help sustain this ministry of rest and reflection that serves souls hungry for nourishment that the world cannot provide. You support the creation of more content designed to bring peace to troubled hearts and hope to discouraged spirits. You participate in something larger than individual consumption of spiritual content and become part of a movement toward gentleness in a culture that often rewards harshness, toward depth in a society that celebrates surface things, toward the ancient rhythms of contemplation and prayer that our ancestors knew, but our generation has largely forgotten in its rush toward progress and productivity and constant stimulation. Your thoughts and reflections about this journey we are sharing mean more than you might realize. For when you share in comments what particular moments or insights have touched your heart, you create opportunities for others to see familiar truths from fresh perspectives, to discover connections they might have missed, to find encouragement in knowing they are not alone in their spiritual struggles or their hunger for authentic relationship with the divine love that created them and sustains them and calls them home to rest in arms that never grow tired of holding souls that have learned to trust completely in grace that never fails. Sometimes people hesitate to engage with spiritual content in public forums, wondering if their faith is strong enough, or their understanding deep enough, or their questions sophisticated enough to contribute meaningfully to conversations about divine love and eternal truth that seem to require expertise they have not acquired through formal education or credentials they do not possess through institutional affiliation or experiences they have not had in dramatic encounters with supernatural power. But remember the disciples we have been observing throughout this story. Ordinary men with extraordinary flaws who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes, yet were chosen by Jesus and entrusted with the most important message in human history. Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy, with truth that brings both comfort for present struggles and confidence for future challenges that will surely come, but need not be faced alone when we know that we are held by love stronger than death and guided by wisdom greater than human understanding and sustained by power that works within us to accomplish far more than we could ask or imagine according to our limited vision of what might be possible when finite hearts connect with infinite grace through faith that may be small as mustard seed, but proves sufficient to move mountains. Rest now in the knowledge that you belong to something beautiful and eternal, that your presence here tonight has blessed this sacred gathering, that your hunger for peace and truth and love connects you to a great cloud of witnesses who have found in Jesus not just historical figure to study, but living friend to follow. Not just teacher to admire, but Savior to trust. Not just example to emulate, but source of life and hope and joy that flows like rivers of living water to refresh souls that have grown weary in their journey toward home. Chapter 9. The 12 and their stories. From among the larger group of followers who had begun gathering wherever Jesus went, Drawn by teachings that spoke to longings buried so deep in their hearts, they had almost forgotten such longings existed beneath daily concerns about food and clothing and shelter that consumed most of their thoughts and energy. Attracted by healings that restored not just physical function, but hope for futures worth living. Inspired by presence that somehow made ordinary moments feel sacred and common encounters seemed charged with eternal significance. Jesus chose 12 men to serve as his apostles, his sent ones, who would eventually carry his message to the ends of the earth, long after his physical presence had been removed from a world that would never be the same for having known him. These 12 were not the kind of men that religious establishments typically selected for positions of spiritual authority or institutional leadership, not polished scholars who had mastered intricate details of scriptural interpretation through years of study in prestigious schools where theological degrees were earned. By memorizing commentaries written by previous generations of experts who had built elaborate systems of thought that often obscured simple truths they were meant to clarify and protect and proclaim, to hearts hungry for authentic encounter with divine love, rather than academic discussion about divine attributes that remained theoretical until experienced personally through relationship that transforms everything it touches. They were not socially prominent figures whose endorsement might lend credibility to new movements or whose financial resources might provide security for organizations that would need material support to accomplish spiritual purposes that often require practical means to reach. Practical people living practical lives, filled with practical concerns about how to survive and thrive in circumstances that frequently challenge faith and test the limits of human endurance and divine grace that must prove itself reliable in real situations with real consequences for real people whose trust deserves authentic demonstration of divine faithfulness rather than empty promises or theological speculation. Instead, Jesus chose ordinary working men whose hearts remained tender enough to recognize divine love when it called their names and invited them into adventure beyond anything their limited imaginations could have conceived, whose souls had not been hardened by success that might make them feel self-sufficient or cynical about possibilities for transformation that seemed too good to be true, to minds that had learned to expect disappointment rather than hope for fulfillment that exceeded their modest dreams about what life might offer to people of their humble background and limited prospects for advancement in societies that valued birth and wealth and education more than character and faith and willingness to serve. Simon, whom Jesus renamed Peter with prophetic insight that looked beyond present instability to future strength that would be forged through failures that taught him complete dependence upon divine grace, rather than human determination or natural ability that might prove adequate for ordinary challenges, but would crumble under extraordinary pressure that only supernatural power could bear. Brought to their fellowship the passionate intensity of a natural leader whose enthusiasm often exceeded his wisdom, but whose love for his master ran deeper than the sea from which he had drawn his living for so many years before hearing a call that would transform him from fisherman to fisher of men whose nets would draw souls from depths of despair to shores of hope. Peter possessed the kind of personality that spoke first and thought later, that acted on impulse rather than careful reflection, that promised more than human strength could deliver, yet somehow always found reserves of divine grace sufficient for whatever challenges love placed before him when he learned to depend not on his own resources, but on power that worked through weakness rather than despite it, that transformed failures into testimonies of divine faithfulness and mistakes into stepping stones towards spiritual maturity that could only be achieved through humbling experiences that broke pride and built dependence upon divine strength rather than human effort that so often proves inadequate when tested by circumstances beyond human control. His journey from impulsive fisherman to rock-solid apostle would take him through depths of failure that would have destroyed lesser souls and heights of faithfulness that would inspire countless generations of believers who would find in his story encouragement for their own struggles with inconsistency, and hope for their own potential despite present limitations that seemed to disqualify them for spiritual service or divine purposes that required stronger characters than they possessed. According to their own honest self-assessment, that made them wonder how God could possibly use such flawed instruments for such important work in such critical times, when so much depended on faithful witnesses. Andrew, Peter's younger brother, brought a quieter but equally devoted heart to their fellowship, possessing the kind of personality that preferred to work behind scenes rather than in spotlight that attracted his more dramatic sibling, whose greatest joy came not from public recognition of his own contributions, but from introducing others to the teacher who had changed his life in ways that made him want to share that transformation with everyone he met, regardless of their background or status or apparent interest in spiritual matters that might seem irrelevant to those focused on immediate concerns about survival and success in worldly terms. Andrew had the gift of seeing potential in unlikely people and creating opportunities for them to encounter Jesus personally, beginning with his own brother and continuing throughout their years, together with consistent ministry of connection that built bridges between seeking hearts and love they were seeking without always knowing how to find it or recognize it when it appeared in forms different from their expectations about how divine intervention should look or feel or operate in human experience that had been shaped by disappointment and disillusionment that made them skeptical about promises that seemed too wonderful to believe. His faithful service behind scenes, his willingness to take secondary role while his brother received more attention and recognition, his persistent efforts to bring others into the circle of divine love rather than focusing on his own advancement or spiritual development that might have seemed more important from purely selfish perspective, demonstrated the kind of humble greatness that Jesus consistently praised above dramatic gestures that impressed crowds but sometimes concealed pride that sought glory for itself, rather than directing all honor toward source of every good gift and perfect blessing that flows from above to hearts that have learned to receive with gratitude and share with generosity. James and John, sons of Zebedee, whose father had built successful fishing enterprise that provided comfortable living for their family until Jesus called them to abandon nets and boats for adventure that would prove far more rewarding than any material success they might have achieved by continuing in commercial fishing that brought temporary security, but could never satisfy longings for meaning and purpose that their souls recognized when they encountered someone whose mission connected individual lives to eternal purposes that would outlast every earthly kingdom and survive every test that time and circumstances could devise to challenge faith and commitment love. These brothers carried nicknames that revealed their fiery temperaments and quick reactions to anything that seemed to threaten or dishonor their beloved master, earning the title Sons of Thunder because of their readiness to call down divine judgment upon anyone who failed to receive Jesus with proper respect or showed insufficient appreciation for teachings that seemed so obviously true and beneficial that opposition could only be explained through willful blindness or deliberate wickedness that deserved immediate and severe punishment, rather than patient instruction that might eventually open closed minds and soften hardened hearts that had been deceived by false shepherds and corrupted by wrong teaching. Their passionate natures served them well in some situations where righteous indignation was appropriate response to injustice, or boldness was needed to proclaim truth in hostile environments that preferred comfortable lies to challenging truths, that demanded change in thinking and living and relating to God and neighbor in ways that violated established customs and social expectations about how religious people should behave in polite society that valued conformity more than conversion and appearance more than authenticity and reputation more than relationship with divine love that cares nothing for human opinions about propriety and respectability. Under Jesus' patient influence that never tried to crush their spirits, but rather channeled their energy into forms that would bless rather than burden those they were meant to serve, Their capacity for righteous anger would be transformed into equally passionate love that would eventually cost them everything they had to give, but would also provide them with everything they truly needed for fulfillment and satisfaction and joy that no earthly circumstance could diminish or destroy, because it flowed from source that never runs dry and never fails to refresh souls that have learned to drink from wells that never disappoint or betray. Trust placed in promises that prove more reliable than sunrise, and more constant than seasons, and more enduring than mountains that seem permanent, but are actually temporary compared to love that lasts forever. Chapter 10. Opposition and Persecution. As Jesus' influence expanded throughout Palestine like ripples spreading across still water, reaching into every corner of Jewish society, where his teachings challenged assumptions that had been accepted without question for generations, and his presence inspired hope for changes that threatened the established order, built upon carefully maintained balances of power and privilege that served those who had learned to manipulate religious systems for personal gain at expense of spiritual health among ordinary people seeking authentic relationship with God. Religious and political authorities who benefited from existing arrangements began to recognize this carpenter from Nazareth not as welcome spiritual reformer whose message might strengthen their institutions and increase their influence over populations that had grown increasingly cynical about religious leadership, but as fundamental threat to systems through which they maintained control. What had begun as curiosity about new teacher whose methods differed from established rabbinical traditions and whose popularity among common people was creating excitement in communities that normally showed little enthusiasm for religious instruction, gradually hardened into skepticism about claims that seemed too extraordinary to accept without more evidence than miraculous healings could provide to minds trained in logical analysis and empirical verification that demanded proof meeting standards established by authorities who had appointed themselves guardians of theological orthodoxy and defenders of spiritual order, that they believed would collapse if challenged by teachings that contradicted their interpretations of ancient texts. This skepticism evolved into active opposition that sought to discredit his authority through public challenges designed to expose weaknesses in his theology or contradictions in his practices that might provide grounds for dismissing him as dangerous deceiver whose influence needed to be curtailed before it could spread further among populations that religious authorities considered their responsibility to guide and protect from false teachings that might lead them astray from paths that had been established by centuries of tradition and scholarly interpretation that represented accumulated wisdom of generations who had wrestled with divine truth and human application in circumstances both similar to and different from those facing contemporary believers who needed reliable guidance from qualified teachers, rather than confusion from unauthorized innovators. The Pharisees, who had built their entire identity around meticulous observance of religious law that distinguished them from common people they considered less spiritually disciplined and theologically informed, found themselves increasingly disturbed by Jesus' apparent disregard for traditions they held sacred as essential expressions of covenant faithfulness that separated God's people from surrounding nations, whose moral standards and religious practices represented everything faithful Jews were supposed to reject as incompatible with divine revelation given through Moses and preserved through generations of careful study and punctilious application to daily life that demonstrated serious commitment to divine will. When his disciples picked grain on Sabbath to satisfy hunger that made concentration difficult during long day of ministry that had begun before dawn and might not end until well after sunset. When he healed sick people on day designated for rest that was supposed to be kept holy through abstinence from work that included medical practice, according to interpretations developed by scholars who had spent years defining boundaries between necessary and unnecessary activities. When he ate meals with tax collectors and sinners without ensuring proper ceremonial cleansing had taken place according to regulations designed to prevent contamination through contact with those whose occupations or lifestyles had rendered them ritually impure. He was challenging not just their practices, but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to honor divine commandments. Their objections to Jesus' behavior were not merely petty criticisms of minor infractions or expressions of personal animosity toward someone whose popularity threatened their influence among populations they had previously controlled through careful maintenance of complex systems designed to regulate every aspect of spiritual life, but sincere expressions of concern about what they perceived as dangerous departures from scriptural authority and ancestral wisdom that had preserved Jewish identity through centuries of foreign occupation and cultural pressure to conform to Gentile customs that would eventually destroy everything that made them distinct as chosen people set apart for divine purposes. They had dedicated their lives to learning complex requirements of religious law that govern every aspect of daily existence, from food preparation to business practices to social relationships, creating elaborate systems designed to help ordinary people avoid accidentally violating divine commandments whose transgression might result in spiritual contamination that would separate them from holy God, who could not tolerate sin in any form or degree, whose presence required perfect purity that fallen humanity could only approximate through careful observance of protective regulations that created buffer zones between clearly forbidden activities and potentially questionable practices. Jesus' casual attitude toward their protective traditions seemed to them like dangerous carelessness at best and blasphemous rebellion at worst, suggesting either ignorance of divine requirements that any properly educated teacher should understand or deliberate, contempt for authority structures that God Himself had established through Moses and maintained through legitimate religious leadership that bore responsibility for interpreting and applying eternal principles to contemporary situations that required wisdom, accumulated through centuries of study and discussion and practical experience, with challenges that arose when idealistic theories encountered complex realities that demanded flexible application of unchanging truths. His responses to their criticisms revealed hard issues behind their theological objections, exposing how easily religious devotion could become religious pride that valued system more than purpose it was meant to serve. How quickly concern for divine honor could transform into concern for personal reputation that depended upon being recognized as especially faithful by others whose approval had become more important than divine approval that comes to those who understand that mercy triumphs over judgment and love fulfills law in ways that external compliance alone can never achieve or demonstrate to watching world that needs to see divine character reflected in human behavior. When He told them that Sabbath was made for humanity rather than humanity for Sabbath, He was turning their understanding of divine purpose upside down in ways that challenged everything they had been taught about proper priorities and spiritual values that should govern relationships between Creator and creation, between divine requirements and human needs, between eternal principles and temporal applications that must be flexible enough to serve love rather than rigid enough to crush spirits. That divine law was meant to liberate from bondage to sin and fear and death that had held humanity captive since Eden's fall and would continue doing so until someone came with power to break chains that no human effort could even weaken. The Sadducees, who controlled temple operations and their lucrative financial arrangements while maintaining careful political relationships with Roman authorities that allowed them to preserve relative autonomy in religious matters as long as they prevented disturbances that might attract unwanted attention from imperial administrators who had little patience for local customs that seemed to interfere with efficient governance and economic stability that served Roman interests more than Jewish welfare, saw Jesus primarily as threat to delicate balance they had achieved between spiritual responsibilities and political realities that required constant negotiation between competing demands of divine loyalty and earthly survival. Their opposition was motivated more by practical concerns about institutional preservation than by doctrinal disagreements about theological interpretations. Though they certainly disagreed with many aspects of his teaching that seemed to undermine authority structures through which they exercised influence over populations whose religious activities generated revenue, essential for maintaining temple services and supporting priestly families whose livelihood depended upon continued functioning of sacrificial system, that Jesus appeared to be challenging through his emphasis on mercy rather than ritual, forgiveness rather than payment, relationship rather than transaction that reduced divine grace to commercial exchange. Chapter 11. The final journey to Jerusalem. Time had come for Jesus to set his face with unwavering determination toward Jerusalem, and everyone who knew him could sense the profound shift in his demeanor as he prepared for what he understood with divine clarity would be his final journey to the holy city, where prophets had always come to deliver their ultimate messages and often to die for truths that religious establishments found too threatening to tolerate, where the greatest demonstration of divine love in human history would soon unfold before a world that desperately needed to witness such complete self-sacrifice offered freely for the sake of human redemption that could be accomplished in no other way. The relaxed pace that had characterized his Galilean ministry, with its gentle rhythms of teaching beside lake shores, where crowds gathered like families around beloved teacher whose words brought comfort to troubled hearts and hope to discouraged spirits, was drawing to its close as he gathered his disciples for pilgrimage that would transform everything they thought they understood about divine power and human salvation, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, about victory that looks like defeat in strength that expresses itself through weakness that confounds human wisdom while revealing divine love in its purest and most powerful form. His closest followers, men who had walked with him through countless villages where his presence had brought healing and restoration to lives broken by disease and sin and despair that had seemed permanent until divine love proved stronger than every force that opposes human flourishing, and divine purposes that will not be defeated by temporary appearances of failure or setback, recognized that something fundamental had changed in their master's attitude and approach to ministry that had previously seemed like pleasant journey through countryside filled with opportunities to demonstrate God's goodness to people who needed evidence that they were loved and valued and remembered by their Creator. There was new intensity in his prayers that lasted longer and seemed to penetrate depths they could not fathom, deeper urgency in his teaching that pressed against hearts with weight of eternity, concentrated into words that would have to sustain his followers through trials they could not yet imagine, quality of purposeful determination that seemed to pull him toward Jerusalem despite obvious dangers that awaited him there, like storm clouds gathering on horizon that everyone could see but no one could prevent from releasing their fury upon landscape that had no choice but to endure whatever heaven chose to send. The religious authorities had already made their hostility clear through a series of confrontations that revealed growing determination to eliminate this teacher, whose influence threatened their carefully constructed systems of control over populations, who were beginning to question whether their traditional leaders truly represented divine will or merely human ambition clothed in religious language that made self-interest sound like spiritual devotion and personal agenda appear to be divine, calling that required obedience from those who had been taught to trust without question, or examination those who claimed authority to interpret God's will for their lives. The political climate was charged with tensions that could explode into violence at any moment, as Passover season always brought increased Roman military presence to Jerusalem, where thousands of pilgrims gathered to commemorate liberation from Egyptian bondage while living under different but equally oppressive foreign occupation that reminded them daily that their promised land was currently controlled by empire that cared nothing for their spiritual heritage or divine destiny, but only for tax, revenue, and political stability that served imperial interests rather than human welfare or divine justice that called all nations to account for their treatment of God's chosen people. Yet Jesus moved toward center of this danger with steady resolve of someone who knew exactly what he was walking into and why such apparent foolishness was actually wisest course of action possible for one whose mission required him to experience everything human existence could offer, including its worst manifestations of hatred and injustice and cruelty that would test divine love to its absolute limits while providing opportunity for that love to demonstrate its unconquerable nature through response that would astonish angels and confound demons, who had never imagined that divine power would choose to express itself through suffering rather than conquest. The disciples followed with growing uneasiness that mixed excitement about accompanying their master to Holy City during most important religious celebration of Jewish year, with increasing anxiety about what such journey might cost them personally in terms of safety and security. They had found in relatively peaceful ministry among villages of Galilee, where people generally received them with gratitude rather than hostility, with openness rather than suspicion that characterized atmosphere in Judea, where religious opposition was more organized and political sensitivity was heightened by proximity to centers of power that could crush perceived threats with swift and merciless efficiency. Word of Jesus' approach spread ahead of them like wildfire racing across dry grassland, reaching villages and towns along their route where people came out to see this teacher, whose reputation had traveled throughout Palestine and beyond its borders into regions where stories of his miraculous healings and revolutionary teachings had created expectations that varied dramatically depending on what hearers hoped to find in someone who claimed authority over life and death, sickness and health, sin and forgiveness that belonged to God alone, according to religious traditions that had never encountered such demonstration of divine power, working through human agent who made no attempt to hide his humanity, while clearly possessing capabilities that transcended every natural limitation. Some came seeking healing for themselves or their loved ones, carrying sick children or elderly parents or disabled relatives who represented last hope for families that had exhausted every other resource in search of relief from conditions that had resisted all conventional treatments, while consuming financial reserves and emotional strength that had once seemed adequate for normal challenges but proved insufficient when confronted with extraordinary needs that required extraordinary intervention from source of power that operated according to principles different from those that governed ordinary human experience and medical knowledge. Others were simply curious about man who had become subject of so much discussion and debate among religious leaders who could not agree about his identity or significance, whose teachings seemed to contradict established interpretations of scriptural prophecy, while fulfilling expectations in ways that traditional messianic theories had not anticipated, whose methods of ministry challenged institutional authorities while demonstrating power that validated claims no mere human being should have been able to make without divine authorization that authenticated his mission and confirmed his identity as promised deliverer. As they approached Jerusalem, Jesus made arrangements to visit Bethany, small village where his close friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had welcomed him many times before, providing place of refuge and authentic fellowship that offered respite from demands of public ministry that never allowed complete privacy or total relaxation from responsibilities that weighed heavily on his human heart, even as his divine nature remained perfectly at peace with Father's will and eternal purposes that would be accomplished regardless of human opposition or earthly circumstances that seemed designed to prevent rather than promote divine plan for human redemption. Chapter 12. The Last Supper and Betrayal. In the upper room that had been carefully prepared according to specific instructions that revealed Jesus' supernatural knowledge of events about to unfold, and his divine control over circumstances that seemed to be spiraling toward catastrophe, but were actually proceeding according to eternal plan that would accomplish salvation through means that appeared to guarantee destruction. As shadows lengthened over Jerusalem and golden light of oil lamps began to flicker against stone walls that would witness the most intimate and heartbreaking scene in all of human history. Jesus gathered with his 12 chosen companions for what he knew with terrible certainty would be their final meal together, before everything they had shared would be shattered by forces that could separate bodies, but could never destroy bonds of love that had been forged through years of walking together. The Passover celebration that spread before them on low table around which they reclined according to custom for festive meals that commemorated freedom from bondage carried accumulated weight of centuries of tradition, each ritual element connecting them to their ancestors' experience of divine deliverance from slavery in Egypt through miraculous intervention that demonstrated God's power over oppressive forces, and his willingness to rescue his people when their situation seemed hopeless and their oppressors seemed invincible and their future seemed to hold nothing but continued suffering under rulers who valued their labor more than their lives and treated them as property rather than human beings created in divine image. Tonight, these ancient symbols would be invested with entirely new meaning as Jesus transformed this memorial of past deliverance into foundation of future salvation that would extend beyond ethnic boundaries to embrace all humanity in scope of divine love that knew no limits based on race or culture or social status or moral performance, that typically determined who was considered worthy of divine favor according to human standards that reflected pride more than grace, exclusion more than inclusion, judgment more than mercy that flows from heart of God, who desires all people to be saved and come to knowledge of truth that sets captives free. As they shared intimate fellowship that had sustained them through years of ministry together, traveling from village to village where Jesus' teaching and healing had transformed countless lives while gradually building opposition from religious authorities who felt threatened by his influence over populations they had previously controlled through careful maintenance of complex systems designed to regulate every aspect of spiritual life. There was atmosphere of both celebration and underlying tension that none of them could quite identify or explain, but all could feel pressing against their hearts, like storm clouds gathering before deluge. Jesus seemed simultaneously peaceful and deeply moved, speaking with intensity that suggested these words carried eternal significance while displaying tenderness that revealed his infinite love for these imperfect men who had walked with him through miracles and controversies, triumphs that had lifted their spirits and disappointments that had tested their faith. Moments of clarity when divine purposes seemed obvious, and periods of confusion when nothing made sense except their commitment to follow wherever he might lead them, even when they could not understand destination or comprehend cost that discipleship might ultimately require. I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, he told them with voice that carried both anticipation of what was to come and sorrow for what it would mean for those he loved more than his own life, whose welfare concerned him more than his own safety, whose future troubled him more than his own fate that had been determined before foundation of world was laid and time began its march toward moment when eternity would invade history through sacrifice that would appear to many like defeat but would actually represent ultimate victory of love over hatred, life over death, hope over despair that had held humanity captive for so long. For I tell you, he continued with authority that came from perfect knowledge of divine plans that human minds could not grasp in their entirety but could trust in their goodness, because they originated in heart of infinite love that never fails those who commit their lives to divine purposes even when they cannot understand methods or timing that serve eternal purposes rather than temporary comfort. I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in kingdom of God. Words that hung in air like prophecy they could not decipher, promise wrapped in mystery that would only become clear through devastating and glorious events of next days. Before they began formal meal with its prescribed rituals and familiar prayers that connected every Jewish family to shared history of divine deliverance and ongoing hope for ultimate restoration of all things, according to divine purposes that transcended individual understanding but could be trusted because they flowed from wisdom and love that never failed. Those who committed their lives to divine will. Jesus rose from his place at table and did something so shocking that it reduced his disciples to stunned silence that spoke louder than any protest. They might have voiced if they had been able to find words adequate to express their amazement and confusion. He removed his outer garments with deliberate care that suggested profound significance in every action, wrapped towel around his waist like common servant preparing for menial labor that even household slaves often tried to avoid because it placed them in position of such humiliation before those they served. Poured water into basin that would normally be used by lowest-ranking servants for washing feet of guests, whose sandaled journey through dusty streets had left them in need of cleansing. Before they could properly participate in sacred meal that required both physical and spiritual preparation. Peter's protest was immediate and vehement, his voice expressing shock and embarrassment that they all felt at witnessing such divine humility, such complete reversal of every normal understanding of authority and respect that governed relationships between teachers and students, masters and disciples, leaders and followers who were supposed to serve rather than be served by those whose superior wisdom and spiritual development entitled them to honor rather than requiring them to humble themselves in ways that violated every expectation about proper protocol and appropriate behavior for someone of Jesus' stature and authority. "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" he asked with incredulity that revealed how completely this act of service contradicted everything he had been taught about proper relationships between people of different ranks and responsibilities. Question that carried undertones of protest against violation of order that seemed essential for maintaining respect and authority. That would be undermined if leaders descended to level of servants and servants were elevated to position of masters in reversal. That confused rather than clarified divine order and human hierarchy. When Jesus gently insisted that Peter could not understand significance of what was happening until later when events would illuminate truths that were hidden in present darkness but would become clear in light of resurrection that would transform their understanding of everything they had witnessed during their years with him. Peter's response was characteristically absolute in its swing, from one extreme to another without finding middle ground that might have been more appropriate to circumstances that required neither total rejection nor excessive enthusiasm but simple trust in wisdom that exceeded human understanding. Chapter 13. The Cross and the Crown. From peaceful intimacy of upper room, where love had been demonstrated through service and covenant had been established, through shared bread and wine that would forever after remind believers of price paid for their redemption and depth of divine love that chose to express itself through ultimate sacrifice. Jesus led his disciples through sleeping streets of Jerusalem toward garden called Gethsemane, place of ancient olive trees where he had often retreated for prayer and communion with Heavenly Father, whose will he had come to accomplish regardless of personal cost that would be extracted from human nature united with divine nature in perfect harmony that would soon experience perfect agony for sake of imperfect humanity. The garden that had been sanctuary of peace during their previous visits, where solitude and natural beauty had provided perfect environment for contemplation and worship that refreshed his human spirit while strengthening his resolve to complete mission that had brought him from heavenly glory to earthly sorrow, felt different this night as they passed beneath branches heavy with leaves that rustled in evening breeze like whispered prayers ascending toward stars that had witnessed countless human struggles but none comparable to cosmic conflict about to unfold between divine love and human sin, between mercy and justice, between life and death that would determine destiny of every soul ever created. Atmosphere was charged with sense of impending crisis that even disciples could sense, despite their incomplete understanding of what was approaching with each passing hour that brought them closer to events that would transform their understanding of everything they thought they knew. About divine power and human salvation, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, about victory that appears as defeat and strength that expresses itself through weakness that confounds worldly wisdom while revealing divine love in its purest form that no earthly mind could have conceived or earthly heart could have imagined possible. Jesus' demeanor had changed from tender intimacy they had experienced during their final meal together to something heavier, more burdened by weight of divine mission as it reached climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into single experience of separation from Father's love that would be more agonizing than any physical torture human cruelty could devise. More devastating than death itself because it would involve spiritual anguish that perfect holiness experiences when it comes into contact with moral corruption that violates every principle of divine character. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to point of death, he told Peter, James, and John, 3 disciples he had chosen to accompany him deeper into garden while others waited at entrance, where they could watch for approaching danger that he knew was coming, but which they hoped might somehow be avoided if they remained vigilant and prepared to defend their master against enemies who sought his destruction through means that would appear to triumph, but would actually accomplish opposite of their intentions, transforming apparent defeat into eternal victory. His words revealed profound humanity of one who was fully divine, showing that incarnation meant experiencing complete range of human emotion, including anguish, so intense it threatened to crush even divine strength that had sustained him through every previous trial and temptation, revealing that salvation would be accomplished not through divine power that bypassed human suffering, but through divine love that entered fully into human experience, including its darkest moments when hope seems extinguished and faith appears foolish and trust feels like betrayal by God, who seems absent when needed most. Stay here and keep watch with me, he requested with voice that carried both authority of divine command and vulnerability of human need for companionship, during hour when isolation would make agony even more unbearable, when loneliness would compound physical and spiritual torment into combination of sufferings that no human being had ever endured or ever could endure except for one whose perfect innocence made him capable of bearing guilt he had never earned, while maintaining perfect love for those whose guilt he was accepting as his own burden to carry to cross, where divine justice would be satisfied and divine mercy would be revealed. Moving beyond even these closest companions whose presence provided some comfort, but could not share burden that was his alone to carry according to divine plan that required substitutionary sacrifice that only sinless one could offer on behalf of sinful humanity. Jesus fell face down on ground that received his prostrate form, like altar prepared for sacrifice that would surpass every offering ever made in human history. His face pressed against earth that would soon drink his blood while his heart broke under pressure of divine wrath against sin that he had never committed. My Father, he prayed with voice that carried agony no human throat had ever expressed, words torn from depths of divine nature, wrestling with human nature in perfect unity, yet perfect tension as 2 aspects of his being confronted reality of what perfect love was willing to endure for sake of imperfect creatures who deserved judgment, but would receive mercy through substitute who would experience their condemnation, if it is possible. May this cup be taken from me. Prayer that revealed both human desire to avoid suffering and divine willingness to embrace whatever Father's love required for human salvation. Yet even in this moment of ultimate testing when human nature recoiled from suffering that lay ahead and divine nature grieved over necessity that made such suffering unavoidable, if love was to triumph over justice, without compromising either attribute of divine character that demanded both perfect righteousness and perfect mercy be satisfied, through means that human wisdom could never have devised. Jesus concluded his prayer with words that secured redemption of everyone who would ever believe in him as substitute for their sins and source of their righteousness, before God who accepts Christ's perfect obedience in place of human disobedience. Not as I will, but as you will, he surrendered with submission that revealed perfect harmony between Father and Son, even in a moment when that harmony would be temporarily broken by sin-bearing, that would separate them in ways that had never occurred in eternity past and would never occur again in eternity future, making this moment unique in divine experience, as love embraced suffering for sake of creatures who could never repay debt they owed for redemption, purchased with blood more precious than all treasures earth could offer. When morning came and betrayer arrived with soldiers sent by religious authorities who had finally found excuse, they needed to arrest troublesome teacher, whose influence threatened their control over populations they considered their property to manipulate and exploit for personal gain. Jesus submitted without resistance to arrest that began process leading to cross, where divine love would triumph over human hatred through apparent defeat that was actually greatest victory in cosmic history of war between good and evil, light and darkness, hope and despair that had raged since Eden's fall. Chapter 14. The promise fulfilled. In profound silence that followed Jesus' death, silence broken only by weeping of women who had loved him and awed whispers of witnesses who recognized they had observed something unprecedented in human experience that challenged every assumption about power and weakness, victory and defeat, life and death that governed human understanding of how divine purposes operate in a world that often seems abandoned by any benevolent force capable of intervening on behalf of those who suffer through no fault of their own. Very fabric of creation seemed to hold its breath as earth and heaven processed completion of most significant event in human history that would divide time itself into before and after this moment. The Roman centurion who had supervised countless executions during his military career, professional soldier accustomed to witnessing death in its most brutal forms, without allowing emotion to interfere with duty. That required him to maintain order among crowds that gathered to watch public punishment, designed to deter crime, through display of consequences that awaited those who challenged imperial authority or violated laws that maintained peace, essential for commerce and governance that served Roman interests more than human welfare, found himself compelled to acknowledge what he had observed during these hours when darkness covered earth and temple veil was torn and rocks split as if nature itself was responding. Surely this was righteous man, he declared with conviction that surprised him, because it emerged from depths of his being, where truth resided despite years of training, designed to suppress such responses in favor of professional detachment that allowed soldiers to perform their duties without being paralyzed by moral qualms or emotional reactions that might interfere with effectiveness required for maintaining imperial order through force when necessary and fear when force was not immediately available to crush resistance or rebellion that threatened stability. Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy member of ruling council who had been secret follower of Jesus throughout his ministry but had lacked courage to publicly identify himself with teacher, whose popularity among common people was matched by hostility from religious authorities, finally found strength to act according to his convictions when love compelled him to ensure that Jesus received honorable burial, befitting his true identity as Son of God whose death had accomplished salvation for all who would believe rather than disgraceful disposal that would add final insult to injuries he had suffered. Together with Nicodemus, another member of religious establishment who had first come to Jesus under cover of darkness to avoid being seen by colleagues who would have questioned his interest in teacher, whose methods challenged their authority and whose message threatened their comfortable assumptions about divine approval based on external performance rather than heart transformation. Joseph carefully removed Jesus' body from cross that had become altar, where perfect sacrifice was offered for imperfect humanity that could never earn forgiveness, but could receive it as gift. They wrapped body in linen cloths with expensive spices that cost them considerable sum, but represented investment in hope that death was not final word in story of one who had claimed power over life and death, who had promised resurrection that seemed impossible according to natural laws, but might be possible according to supernatural power that had demonstrated itself through miracles, They had witnessed during his ministry among people who had experienced healing and restoration that defied medical explanation and challenged every assumption about what was possible when divine love encountered human need. The tomb where they laid Jesus' body was new one that Joseph had prepared for his own eventual use, carved from solid rock in garden near place of crucifixion, sealed with massive stone that would require several strong men to move under normal circumstances, guarded by Roman soldiers who had been posted there at request of religious authorities who remembered his predictions about rising from dead on third day and wanted to prevent disciples from stealing body and claiming resurrection had occurred when no such miracle had taken place. Early on first day of week, before dawn had fully broken over Jerusalem, still sleeping in aftermath of Passover celebration that had been overshadowed by execution that had shocked even those who had demanded it, Mary Magdalene made her way to tomb carrying spices to anoint Jesus' body, her heart heavy with sorrow, but her devotion compelling her to perform final act of service for one who had transformed her life by freeing her from demons that had tormented her and giving her purpose and identity and hope she had never known before encountering divine love that saw past her failures to her potential. When she arrived at Garden Tomb, she discovered something that challenged every college assumption about permanence of death and finality of separation that death creates between those who remain and those who depart. Something that would transform her grief into joy, her despair into hope, her questions into certainty about divine love's ultimate victory over every force that opposes human flourishing and divine purposes that will not be defeated by temporary appearances of failure or setback that break hearts, but cannot break love that holds universe together. The massive stone that had sealed entrance was rolled away, not from outside as if someone had broken in to steal body, but from inside as if someone had broken out, lying at angle that suggested it had been moved not by human strength but by supernatural force that made its weight irrelevant to purposes that operated according to principles that transcended physical laws and human limitations that govern ordinary existence, but prove inadequate when divine power intervenes in ways that demonstrate love's triumph over death's apparent finality. Angels whose very presence transformed tomb into sanctuary of divine glory greeted her, bewilderment with words that would echo through eternity, bringing hope to every heart that has ever been broken by loss and every soul that has ever wondered whether love is strong enough to overcome death and separation and all forces that threaten to destroy what God has created and called good, despite its current brokenness and need for redemption that only divine intervention can provide. Why do you look for living among dead? They asked with voices that carried music of heaven into earthly sorrow that had seemed final and irreversible until this moment, when impossible became reality and death revealed itself as powerless against life that flows from source that never runs dry. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said, their invitation to come and see place where he lay becoming invitation to witness evidence that death had been conquered. Grave had been robbed of its victory. Hope was not only restored, but vindicated in most wonderful way imaginable. Chapter 15. Until we meet again in peace. Here at gentle conclusion of our sacred journey together through life and love of Jesus Christ, as peaceful darkness of night settles around you like most comforting embrace that speaks of divine care for every detail of your existence from greatest triumph to smallest concern that weighs upon your heart, and your breathing naturally deepens into rhythm of blessed rest that comes from knowing you are held by arms that will never grow weary of carrying you. Through every trial and every joy that awaits you in days ahead, I want to pause with you in profound gratitude for these precious hours we have shared walking together through most beautiful and transformative story ever told to human hearts that hunger for hope and thirst for love that never fails. We began this evening with you carrying whatever burdens today had placed upon your shoulders, perhaps feeling overwhelmed by responsibilities that seemed to multiply faster than your strength to meet them. possibly questioning your worth or wondering if there truly existed love in this universe that knew your name and cared about your deepest needs and longest struggles that sometimes feel too heavy for human heart to bear without breaking under weight of disappointment and discouragement that accumulates like dust on traveler's cloak until rest and refreshment wash it away. We conclude with you resting securely in embrace of that very love we have encountered together, surrounded by truth that you have never been alone and never could be alone, because you are cherished beyond your ability to comprehend by one who spoke galaxies into existence, yet pays attention to every whispered prayer and silent longing of your heart that may feel insignificant when compared to cosmic forces and global events, but matters infinitely to divine love that measures significance not by size, but by depth of care invested in each precious soul created for relationship with their Maker. The Jesus we have met together in these quiet hours is not merely figure from ancient history, confined to pages of old books or memories of civilizations that have crumbled into dust, but living presence who reaches across every barrier of time and space to touch tired hearts exactly like yours, to offer rest to weary souls exactly like yours, to extend forgiveness and acceptance to imperfect people exactly like you and me, who need grace more than we need anything else this world could offer to satisfy longings that only divine love can reach and heal and fill completely. His love transcends historical boundaries and cultural limitations to meet you in your present circumstances with same tenderness that characterized his interactions with disciples who disappointed him, and crowds who misunderstood him, and enemies who betrayed him, yet never exhausted his capacity for forgiveness or diminished his commitment to their welfare, despite their treatment of him during years when he walked among them, demonstrating what divine love looks like when it takes human form and enters human experience with all its pain and beauty and complexity that requires wisdom beyond human understanding to navigate successfully. If this sacred journey has brought even moment of genuine peace to your troubled heart that has been carrying anxiety and worry like stones in pocket that grow heavier with each passing day, if these ancient stories have awakened something beautiful in your spirit that had been sleeping under weight of disappointment and discouragement that accumulated through experiences of broken promises and failed relationships and dreams that died slow deaths, if you have found yourself breathing more freely or feeling more connected to love that holds universe together, then you have discovered treasure worth guarding and sharing with others who walk same pathways of seeking and struggling. This treasure is meant to be shared with others who are walking same pathways of seeking and struggling that you have walked, who are carrying same burdens of loneliness and fear and confusion that you have carried, who are asking same questions about meaning and purpose and hope that you have asked during seasons when life seemed empty of divine presence and barren of divine purpose that could make suffering meaningful and struggles worthwhile instead of senseless endurance of pain that serves no purpose except to test limits of human patience and faith. By choosing to join our family of fellow seekers through subscription that connects you to continued journey together through contemplative narratives that nourish rather than drain, that build up rather than tear down spirits that have been wounded by harsh words and disappointed by broken promises and confused by messages that demand more than they give, you become part of something that transcends individual experience and becomes participation in eternal story of divine love pursuing human hearts across every barrier of time and culture and circumstance that might seem to separate finite creatures from infinite Creator who bridged that gap through incarnation. Your presence in this community matters more than you might realize, dear friend, because when you open your heart to receive divine love through these ancient stories that never grow old or lose their power to transform lives and change destinies, you create ripples that extend far beyond your individual experience, to bless everyone whose path intersects with yours in days and weeks and months ahead, everyone who encounters in your eyes something of peace you have found, who hears in your voice something of hope you have received, who senses in your presence something of love that has claimed you as its own and will never let you go, regardless of what storms may come or what challenges may test your faith. Sleep now in perfect peace, surrounded by perfect love, held by perfect grace that covers every imperfection and transforms every weakness into strength, every failure into learning, every ending into new beginning, filled with possibilities as infinite as love that created you and will never stop believing in wonderful person you are becoming through divine transformation, working patiently in depths of your being until that day when faith becomes sight and hope becomes reality and love reigns, eternal in hearts that have learned to trust, completely in promises that prove more reliable than sunrise, and more constant than seasons, and more enduring than mountains that seem permanent, but are actually temporary compared to love that lasts forever. Good night, dear one, and may divine love fill your dreams with visions of glory that awaits you. May angels watch over your sleep with protection that never fails, and may you awaken tomorrow refreshed not only in body, but renewed in spirit, ready for another day of walking in love that makes every ordinary moment sacred and every simple act of kindness participation in divine purposes that extend far beyond what eyes can see or minds can comprehend, but hearts can trust completely because they flow from source of all good gifts and perfect blessings that never disappoint those who wait with patient hope for fulfillment of every promise made by lips that never lie and heart that never changes in its commitment to those who call upon name that is above every name and trust in love that never fails.